Oh, g'day, May 40 here. So we have about 70% of the United States has been freezing, and the situation's been particularly dire in Texas. They've been freezing, and they've been out of power. They've had rolling blackouts. The Texas energy grid is not connected to the rest of the country, and a large part of the problem is that Texas, along with other states, other countries, has placed a great emphasis on renewable energy. And renewable energy has been very expensive. And when push comes to shove, it's often not come through just when it is needed most. So what the hell is going on with renewables?
Joe Biden and Democrats better think twice about unleashing the Green New Deal on the whole country. Just take a look at what's happening in Texas. The state hit with massive power outages from a giant winter storm that's hammering most of the country. 4 million people in the state are in the dark and don't have heat. The cold crippling Texas's power grid. And part of the reason why is because wind turbines are frozen. Half of the state's wind power capacity was reportedly offline. Former Energy Secretary Rick Perry says what's happening in his home state could be a sign of things to come.
If this Green New Deal goes forward the way that the Biden administration appears to want it to, then we'll have more events like we've had in Texas all across the country as we strangle the diversity that we're going to need to keep this country going and keep this country economically powerful.
And the Wall Street Journal editorial board summing things up this way, quote, "Herein is the paradox of the left's climate agenda. The less we use fossil fuels, the more we need them. The Biden administration's plan to banish fossil fuels is a greater existential threat to Americans than climate change." All right, Dana, I know you read that editorial at 6 o'clock this morning, and it makes a great point. You have to have coal, you have to have nuclear as backup in the mix when something like this goes down.
It's a tragic situation. 15 people have lost their lives, and that's just so far. When you don't have heat
Makes a great point.
and you don't have any electricity in the middle of a winter snap like the cold snap like this, it's terrifying. Claire McCaskill, the former senator of Missouri, she tweeted Texans mocking them, saying, "Stay home to stay safe." And she was making fun of them basically because that was what she thinks that a lot of people in Texas did not do during COVID.
Hey, so do you put too much emphasis on politics? Yeah, if you're trying to point score due to the situation in Texas, then if you're trying to point score when there's some natural disaster, trying to make partisan points, then if you're mocking people who are going through great suffering, like the people in Texas, then your worldview is out of whack. You are out of whack. There's something very wrong with you if you're going to use things like this cold spell and widespread power outages in Texas to score partisan points. So made me think about the ubiquity of the human need for a magic key, right? One perspective on life that unleashes everything. So when I was growing up as a Seventh-day Adventist, there was a widespread view in the church I was growing up in that the only saved people are Seventh-day Adventists, that 144,000 Seventh-day Adventists will be saved at the end of time, and pretty much everyone else will be cast off into a lake of fire, right? Everyone else sucks to be you. Only 144,000 righteous, the Seventh-day Adventist elite, will get to go to the world to come. So that perspective got broadened a little bit as I grew up. There are three main strands of Seventh-day Adventism. There's traditional Seventh-day Adventism, which places most of its emphasis on the distinctive teachings of the church, such as that only 144,000 people will be saved. Then there are evangelical Seventh-day Adventists who feel more in common with other evangelical Christians. And then there are liberal Seventh-day Adventists who are in it for the lifestyle. So my father was evangelical, and so this was a little more enlightened liberal perspective on things. So essentially, the evangelical Christian perspective I was raised with was that if you're in Christ, then you're saved. So essentially, the most important thing to know about somebody is he in Christ? Is he a Christian or is he not a Christian? And so if you had that magic key, those who are in Christ, they're going to live forever in heaven with God. They're righteous. They're connected to the divine. And these are the people who are most likely to act in a moral way. These are the people who will drive civilization forward. These are the people who know what's going on. They know the score. They know the game plan. They know the rules, right? To be a Christian is synonymous with being a good person. That's the upbringing that I had. Then I decided to jump into atheism at about age 18. And I was going to college, and I had this eloquent political science professor, Larry White, who is not a socialist, but he managed to articulate some socialist ideas in a compelling way. And so I thought, oh, what the heck? I've always been right wing. Let me embrace a Marxist perspective for a while. And I read like 50 books on Marxism, and I learned the rhetoric. And again, I had this magic key for unlocking how the world works. It was the means of production. Who controls the means of production? Marxism said, hey, we've got the magic key for understanding history, that societies move in certain inevitable patterns from primitive to feudal to capitalist and then socialist. That's the inevitable outcome of history. And so this was thrilling that, oh, wow, I had a magic key to unlock how the world works, how history works, how societies develop. Look, how old were you when you started celebrating your birthday? So birthdays weren't a big deal growing up in my Seventh-day Adventist home. I only recall one time when we celebrated Christmas, and that was when my secular sister came to town. And she insisted on celebrating Christmas sometime around, I think I was about age 13. So we didn't celebrate Christmas very much. Traditional Seventh-day Adventists don't tend to celebrate Christmas because they view it as pagan. So what about birthdays? Birthdays were not a big deal, but I mean, I'm sure I got small gifts and acknowledgement. I don't know, probably starting about age 5 or 6. Holly says the Orthodox Church says something like, we know where God's grace is, but we don't know where it's not. God can have mercy upon whomever God has mercy. So if you read Mein Kampf, you can see that Hitler believes that he stumbled upon a magic key that explains why Germany lost World War I, that explains why Europe and Germany is in the mess that it's in. And the magic key is the Jewish question. So for many people on the alt-right, Jews are responsible for pretty close to 100% of problems in the world. So Age of Reason, he would say that Jews are responsible for pretty darn close, more than 99% of problems in the world. Eric Stryker would say that Jews are responsible for more than 99% of problems in the world. And so that made me think, what are left-wing versions of the JQ, right? So on the far right, the Jewish question has boiled down to, Jews responsible for most of the problems in the world. And so there are all these esoteric theories and ways of arguing that even in countries where there are very few Jews, such as Sweden or Switzerland, the Netherlands, Norway, Scandinavian region, Germany, that anything wrong with those countries is the fault of the Jews. And so this is a unifying perspective on much of the alt-right. So I was thinking, what are the left-wing equivalents? Because when we're seeing what's going on in Texas, all the news stories are about climate change, right? When you have fires in California, you get news stories about climate change. When you have fires in Australia, it's climate change, right? I remember when we had global cooling, right? Global cooling was the big threat in the 1970s. There was, I think, a Newsweek cover story, global cooling. That was the big threat. And then starting in the 1980s, it was global warming. That was what was going to destroy the planet. And then they got away from that around the aughts, and it became climate change. And you can't deny or refute climate change because obviously the climate is constantly changing. The climate has always changed. The climate is changing now. I have absolutely no doubt that the climate is changing now. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there are parts of the world that are steadily getting warmer over the past few decades. Now, in modern parlance, climate change as the overriding issue of our time doesn't just mean that the climate is changing, right? It's a euphemism for arguing that not only is the climate changing, but the change is overwhelmingly driven by things that human beings are doing, and it's going to lead to catastrophe unless we completely remake our economies and spend the equivalent of trillions of dollars. Right? That's what climate change means. It doesn't mean literally climate change, the climate's changing. Obviously, the climate's constantly changing, but it invokes a whole conspiratorial worldview that we're facing cataclysm, we're facing end times, and unless we completely change the way we do things, that our planet is essentially going to just burn up. And that's what climate change means as a conspiracy theory, as a magic key that unites much of the left.
To me, this is not funny. It's very troubling to look at what the future could bring. So Biden's climate agenda, Jesse, says that by 2035, we'd have 100% renewable energy. Like, I can actually see 2035 from my house. Like, it's not that far from here. I talked to a guy named Dan Turner over at Power of the Future. Just a couple of things to note. In 2009, coal-fired power plants generated nearly 37% of the Texas electricity. Wind was 6%. Since then, since 2009, 3 Texas coal-fired power plants have closed. Wind power has more than quadrupled as the transmission lines from the wind got into the urban areas. But in the same period, energy consumption rose by 20%. Because you have all these people that want to move to Texas because it's a better lifestyle, right? How many people, we've shown you how much it costs to get a one-way U-Haul. Kennedy must not like that answer. To get a one-way U-Haul from California to Texas,
Kennedy's
it's like $1,000.
truck was powered by a wind turbine. I'm sorry about that, Kennedy.
And Jesse, last night, did you see what happened when Rick Perry was on with Tucker Carlson? The power went out, and Tucker said, "Okay, you're proving my point." Like as we sit here, I am for all sorts of different types of energy mixes. I like solar, great.
Yeah.
Wind, great. Like have all of it. But the thing is that the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. Coal will burn. We're working on ways to do it more cleanly, but we're not going to get to 100% renewable by 2035. Fingers crossed for good weather.
So I was having discussions on this channel a few days ago, and there are some people got the perspective that if anything's a chemical, then it's inferior to that which is natural. But everything that is natural is also composed of chemicals. It's not like, say, psycho drugs that's all completely distinct from nature. It simply takes elements of nature and rearranges them. So for some people, natural, that is what is healthy, that which is sacred, that which is good, and chemical, that which is disgusting and evil and destructive. But it just doesn't stand up to any rational inquiry. There are tons of things that are natural and will kill you. At the same time, there are tons of things, tons of chemicals that unless certain people take them on a daily basis, they will die. So there's no inherent sacredness to that which is natural. And there's no inherent sacredness to, say, what is renewable fuels or wind turbine energy. All right, everything is a matter of what's the price you pay and what do you get. Right, but people on both the left and the right, they want to accord sacred status to certain things and kind of remove them from empirical investigation.
It's not a sound policy.
I agree with that. And you mentioned Claire McCaskill. Greg, I think someone else on NBC News said something pretty dopey about what's going on down in Texas. Let's roll the tape of Chuck Todd.
The only upside here is I assume the cold weather motivates people to wear a mask because it's one extra layer on your face.
Okay, Greg.
He needs 4 layers on his face, 4 bags around his face. That was stupid. People say stupid things. I have said stupid things. But this is actually a reality check.
Yeah.
The problem is, when it comes to green energy, the people that advocate for it, they don't like reality. Windmills and solar are backup singers. They aren't the lead singer. Gas and coal, that's Tony Orlando. Windmills and solar, that's Dawn. Ironically, the backup singers also need backup singers, and that's the curse of intermittent fuels. They're intermittent, which means they flunk the single most important test of fuel sources, reliability. So if you change the way you look at windmills, you will actually like them. Windmills are not fuel sources. They are fuel savers. So if they only generate 1% capacity, of the capacity, which is tiny, which has happened in England and in Germany, just 1%, at least you can say, well, hey, we're saving 1% of our coal, right? But when you look at these massive farms, it's not worth it. I think the answer is in front of our face, and we know this. It's nuclear energy. It's clean. It's safe. The Dems, even Greenpeace, former leaders of Greenpeace and other environmental groups are admitting that they were wrong. Sadly, the entertainment industry of the 1970s pretty much dictated our energy policy, and we're still battling our way out of that.
Kennedy, it looks like the people that installed the wind turbines in Texas, they didn't pay that extra $2,000 to install the de-icing technology. That they have this de-icing technology in other windmills all over the country, but they were a little cheap down there in the wind guys with Texas, and it's now costing lives.
That's absolutely right. And we have to ask ourselves, what kind of a country do we want to live in? And what are we willing to sacrifice in the name of the climate cult? Everyone wants a cleaner planet. Everyone wants cleaner energy. But I don't think there's been a thorough investigation, to Greg's point, about really finding new technologies. The private sector is going to do that. But Greg's absolutely right about nuclear.
Every time a government has mandated, massive amounts of natural power, renewable energy, then under pressure, energy prices skyrocket because these natural renewable sources of energy simply aren't as efficient and are not as dependable as fossil fuels. So in much of Australia, electricity prices went up 300% when the government mandated a certain percentage of the power must come from renewable sources. So it comes from a sacralization of anything that you can call renewable. All right, just like for Christians, if someone says he's a Christian, then that puts them in a totally different category. That someone who's Christ-like, this is a sacred person, and for people on the alt-right, anything that's Jewish is inherently evil, and you'll find in Jewish extremism, anything that's Goyish is essentially suspect. So you'll find among many traditional Jews, they understand everything that happens in the world is for the sake of the people Israel, that it contains a message for the Jews. That Rabbi Victor Miller said, if you see a one-legged Puerto Rican going down the street, there's a message there for Klal Yisrael. So you find Jews who see absolutely everything through a prism of what's good for the Jews, what does this have to do with the Jews? You have many Christians who see things solely through the prism of, is this person in Christ or is he not in Christ? You have the alt-right who sees everything in terms of, is this Jewish or is this Aryan? And then you have people on the left, they have this conspiracy theory of climate change that explains every natural disaster in the world today. In 1978, California passed Proposition 13, which restricted taxation on home ownership. And from 1978 to the present time, every government funding shortage in California is attributed to Proposition 13. That's just like the immediate explanation that is at hand. Oh, it's Prop 13. Prop 13 is why we can't have better schools. Prop 13 is why we can't have cleaner streets. Prop 13 is why we can't have better cops. Every problem with government is because of Prop 13. So people love these easy explanations, whether it's Prop 13 or climate change or it's the Jews.
And thorium, and there are ways of producing an abundance of clean energy, which they do around the world where they don't have access to natural gas pipelines like they do in Texas. But if you force a green economy too quickly, you are going to sacrifice your economy, and you're no longer going to be living in a first world country. You're going to be living in a third world country where it is very common in places like Venezuela and Zimbabwe to have intermittent blackouts. But guess what? It's no way to live. And when it's cold and people can't go anywhere, they're already immobile and vulnerable, they are going to die. And if you send them to shelters, then they are going to catch COVID and they are going to die. So it is it's very, very inhumane, and shame on the state government for not having better foresight, not only for a particular storm, but the consequences of this sort of green energy.
Yeah, and our hearts go out to all the people in Texas suffering right now. All right, Juan, tell us how this is all Trump's fault.
Well, let me just introduce.
Okay. So Elliot Blatt makes the point that your metabolism evolved in the absence of industrially refined chemicals. Okay, but there's an industrially refined chemical that will enable you to live. In the absence of taking that industrially refined chemical, you'll die. Are you going to turn your back on an industrially refined chemical? If without an industrially refined chemical, you have half the energy and half the functionality that you would with an industrially refined chemical, really, are you going to turn it away? Now, the United States feeds its population using less than 1% of its population in the field of agriculture. So if you removed industrial chemicals from agricultural production, that would not happen. So would you be willing to, say, pay 5 times as much for your food for an absence of industrial chemicals? Would you be willing to have, say, 2/3 of the gross domestic product that we have now if we did away with industrial chemicals, right? You couldn't drive a car without using industrial chemicals. You couldn't have air conditioning or central heating. You couldn't have a first world economy without industrial chemicals. So that which is natural is not inherently good, and that which is artificial is not inherently bad. That which is Jewish and that which is non-Jewish are not inherently good or bad. That which is Christian or that which is non-Christian are not inherently good or bad. Someone identifies as a Christian, that tells you nothing about them. They may be on the right, they may be on the left. They may be decent, upstanding, ethical people. They may be scum, right? If someone's Jewish, that again doesn't tell you anything. They may be on the right, they may be on the left, they may be upstanding, they may be disgusting. If someone's Australian or someone's Japanese, again, it doesn't tell you anything inherent about the person. So people love these quick, easy explanations.
If you sacralize your political ideology's heroes, you cannot think straight. And this is where we are in the sciences. It's obvious that if you're a social conservative, evangelical, young earther, creationist, you probably shouldn't be going into a PhD program in biology or geology. Okay? It's just going to be really hard for you to deal with reality if you deny evolution and the age of the Earth. Okay? You shouldn't go into American history if you say America is the greatest country on Earth and it simply cannot have committed war crimes. We just don't do that. I mean, that should be a disqualification. But what about on the left? Suppose you had students coming in who deny that IQ matters. Not anymore, but for decades, it's just very uncomfortable because there are race differences in IQ. The general view is IQ is a bad test. It doesn't measure and it doesn't matter. We can't allow that IQ matters. Because IQ is heritable, we can't allow that heritability matters. Environment has to be everything. The left has always believed that environment can overcome everything else. So can you do social science if you deny heritability? You think everything is environment when it isn't? The left is full of sex difference deniers. Hormones are fine for other animals. Hormones affect behavior in other animals. But how sexist of you to suggest that male and female differences could in any way be due to the fact that they are exposed to different hormones prenatally. That just is ruled out of bounds. Now, it's not that the left denies evolution. That's fine for other animals. But evolutionary psychology? Well, that's almost sexist and racist. No, evolution didn't shape human beings. And last, the biggest area in my field is the study of stereotypes and prejudice. And it's an important social problem, but we try to solve it while not allowing anybody to even mention the largest cause of stereotypes and prejudice. There is a small research literature showing that the reason why people hold stereotypes is because they're accurate. Most stereotypes do correspond to some measurable, observable fact about the environment. Now, they're often misinterpretations. The stereotype often lingers long after the reality changes. So I'm not saying that stereotypes are perfectly accurate, but I'm saying a big part of the story is that people are really good at detecting differences between groups. We're intuitive Bayesians. We pick up frequencies. You can't stop the brain from doing this. So suppose you had a whole group of people coming into social psychology who were the equivalent of young Earth creationists, who say, I'm going to study stereotyping and prejudice, but I'm going to just rule in advance that there are no differences between groups. And now I'm going to study what's left. That's where we are. So my point is that all groups value the truth. Okay? Every ideological group believes it values the truth. All groups hold something sacred. And if you hold something sacred, then as I've said, no trade-offs, no nuance. That means that your sacred values are going to conflict with the truth. And when that happens, all groups are the same. They throw truth under the bus, and they go with their sacred values. And that's where we are. So I hope I've shown you that political homogeneity, now that we no longer have conservatives in some academic fields, it's a problem. It's bad for our science. We need to clean up our act. We talk a lot about the value of diversity. Intellectual diversity is the most important kind of diversity there could be. And I hope finally I've answered for you why it is that social justice has a bad name in much of the country. So how could anyone not want social justice? I'm not denying that selfishness and racism are part of it, but I'm saying that there are some valid moral objections. Why do conservatives distrust scientists, and especially social scientists? Well, there are some slight differences in need for cognition. There are some reasons why liberals will predominate. But a lot of the distrust, as I've shown you, is because there are objections to the politicization of science, especially the social sciences. I hope then that I have inspired the Duke University family towards ever greater achievements in social justice, which I hope will mean it's time for a re-examination. The 60s are over and done with. We have a new set of challenges, much more about class than race. Let's think about what it means. What does justice really mean in this day and age? And let's think really carefully before we claim to enlist science as being on our side. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so you hear that routinely on the left, that science is on our side, that Republicans deny science, but there are lots of established scientific truths that both sides like to ignore. I've never read a book on climate change. I've never read a book on global warming, so I don't know very much. Leponius Maximus Meridius says it is impossible to get off oil, absolutely impossible. That sounds right to me. Oil is what led to the population explosion from 1 billion to 8 billion. Look up fractional distillation, bro. Look at the diagram and think. You will then understand why we can never get off oil. Green energy people are either grifters or morons. There is no in between. Only people with a 120 plus IQ can understand why it is impossible to get off oil. Address my point, Mr. Ford. See if you can figure out why it is impossible to give up oil. I just take that for granted, but I don't know anything about fractional distillation. It's not the obvious stuff you constantly hear. Elliot says there is no non-manipulated data that supports the global warming hypothesis. Come on, Elliot. That sounds so sweeping. I mean, you're making a sweeping statement that I'm going to wager you don't know very much about. How many books have you read on global warming? Or is that coming from seeing a video by Ivor Cummins? Laponia says, my position is not absurd at all. It's 100% truth. No way around it. I'm still perfect, bro. Ford doesn't read book. Ford is better than Ford knows nothing. Come on, Elliot. Yeah. I mean, of course there's global warming. Or of course there's climate change, right? That climate change is, it's constant. It would make no sense that you would not have climate change. But to use climate change as the explanation for everything that happens. So now, trying to understand what's going on in Texas, New York Times right at the top. It's a glimpse of America's future. Climate change means trouble for power grids. Systems are designed to handle spikes in demand, but the wild and unpredictable weather linked to global warming will very likely push grids beyond their limits. So they start off with climate change because you can't argue against climate change. Of course, the climate is always changing. But then they sneak in there with global warming. So it's like, when I was dating, it's like I'd give the girl a hug, we'd hold hands, I'd give her a nice kiss on the lips, and then I'd start going further, right? But I didn't start off with, global warming. I just kept it nice and innocuous, like shook her hand, held hands, maybe slipped my arm around her during the movie, nice little kiss on the lips. I didn't go straight for the old global warming. I warmed her up first, right? Something innocuous, something that she couldn't object to. I made her feel nice and comfy and safe. And then I go for the global warming. And so it's the same way with the New York Times, like climate change, that's in the headline, right? That just warms us up. And it's like, okay, can't argue with that. Of course, the climate's always changing. Then then when you're all relaxed, all right, and it's like, oh, I feel safe here. And then suddenly, this hand goes right down your pants and grabs your genitals. It's like, oh, it's global warming, right? Yeah, I was fine with climate change, but just when I was relaxing here, the New York Times is slipping its hand down my pants and grabbing my genitals, and it's squeezing in a very painful manner. I remember something like, 9th, 10th grade, I was staying with a friend, and he had, his sister had this other girl around, and she used to really like to, grab guys' dicks and twist them really hard, so it was painful. And so we experienced tremendous pain, but at the same time, we kind of egged it on because it was kind of exciting. And, memories. It was such a confusing time to be a 16-year-old. All right, New York Times, huge winter storms have plunged. All right, man, everything's so sexualized in the New York Times. Plunged large parts of the central and southern United States into an energy crisis as frigid blasts of Arctic weather crippled electric grids, left millions of Americans without power amid dangerously cold temperature. Right? We never would have had, Arctic weather blasting, plunging, crippling our country without climate change and global warming. Right? So we're supposed to believe that, and I don't know that it's not true. I simply don't know much about global warming and climate change, but they warm us up with climate change is thrusting, it's crippling, it's blasting our country, and then with dangerously cold temperatures, and then this is all evidence for why we've got global warming. And I'm not saying it's not true. I simply don't know enough. So in Texas, this is the most severe situation. 4 million people woke up Tuesday morning facing mounting power failures. So record-breaking cold weather spurred residents to crank up their electric heaters, push demand for electricity beyond the worst-case scenarios that grid operators planned for. Many of the state's gas-fired power plants were knocked offline amid icy conditions. Some plants had fuel shortages as natural gas demand spiked, and then many of Texans' wind turbines froze and stopped working. But this was a smaller part of the problem. So everyone on the right, I noticed on Twitter, saying, oh, it's Texas's wind turbines. They're not spinning because they can't handle the cold. That just shows wind turbines are useless. Well, the frozen wind turbines is a much smaller part of the problem. So Texas has suffered from rotating blackouts to try to avoid a broader collapse of the system. And crisis highlights a deeper warning for power systems throughout the country. So electric grids, the more redundancy, the more resiliency you build into an electric grid, the more expensive it is. So grid operators, they try to aim for the sweet spot. They could build more redundancy, more resiliency, but that costs a lot of money. And so people don't want to spend a lot of money. On the other hand, extreme weather comes along, and now you've got much of the state with rotating power failures. Vast majority of these failures have been at thermal plants, natural gas generators, so plunging temperatures, paralyzed plant operations, soaring demand for natural gas leaves plants struggling to procure fuel. They're in big trouble. So build in more resiliency. That's the answer, but it's costly, right? And you don't know when and where it will be needed. So you can give wind turbines, heaters, and you can give other devices the warmth they need to operate in icy conditions. That's done in the upper Midwest, where this kind of cold weather is more frequent. You can have gas plants can be built to store oil on site to burn the fuel if needed. That's what's done in the Northeast, where natural gas shortages are more common. You can design markets to pay extra to keep a fleet of backup power plants in reserve in case of emergencies. This is often done in the mid-Atlantic. All these solutions cost money, and grid operators are wary of forcing consumers to pay extra for safeguards if they don't think they will be needed. So building in this resilience comes at a cost. So this is all a difficult balancing act. Life is a difficult balancing act. Like loyalty is a wonderful value, but truth is also a value. So what happens when truth and loyalty conflict? So truth, loyalty, great values, but there are many values in life. Getting along with other people, that's a beautiful value, but also pursuing your own individual priorities is also a great value. So how does one handle one's desire for community, one's desire for relationships, and one's desire for pursuing one's own individual goals? All right, these are in constant conflict. So one of the great things I like about Judaism is that it recognizes that goals are constantly in conflict, that it's not like love, right, is the greatest goal. So I heard that a lot growing up in Christianity, and we live in a Christian country, so you often hear love extolled as the greatest value, but love's not the greatest value. Love is one value in a whole constellation of values. So New York Times says climate change is making it harder to prepare. So the United States is getting warmer as global temperatures rise, and cold weather extremes are becoming less common. But climate scientists say that global warming could paradoxically bring more winter storms. So they win every way. There are more extreme winter storms. That's just example of global warming, bro. So Arctic warming is weakening the jet stream, which usually holds back frigid polar vortexes. So that allows cold air to escape to the south when a blast of additional warming strikes the stratosphere and deforms the vortex. So we get episodes of plunging temperatures, even in places that rarely get nipped by frost. So what I want to know, how good are these climate scientists? So epidemiologists, for example, they are not our best and brightest, right? Epidemiology is not a high IQ profession. It does not attract people with the same IQ as those studying math or philosophy or biology or chemistry or banking or going on Wall Street, right? Epidemiology is among the various academic disciplines. It's more mediocre to low IQ. So what about these climate scientists who are telling us about that these sudden plunging, thrusting cold temperatures, these Arctic vortexes, they are all a result of global warming? Are they our best and brightest? I mean, how smart do you have to be to get a degree in climate science? Overman says, one day it snows and then all the low IQ riffraff come out of the wood work and claim that this is proof that there is no global warming. Exactly. I simply don't know enough. Green energy is a phenomenal grift worthy of respect. So Michael Moore did a documentary, helped to produce a green energy documentary about all the problems with...
and we're just going to fuck it up like we did Earth.
Well, I think that we will be here for a long time, but we will change. We're going to turn back into apes.
So this is the Planet of the Humans documentary directed by Jeff Gibbs.
Have you ever wondered what would happen if a single species took over an entire planet? Maybe they're cute, maybe they're clever, but lack a certain, shall we say, self-restraint? What if they go too far? What if they go way, 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 way too far? How would they know when it's their time to go?
So the more the left uses science to beat up on conservatives, then the more obviously it seems politicized. And we see this with the reactions to COVID.